And this is like an hour, right?
Yeah, an hour.
Okay.
Welcome back, everyone, for another episode of the Indigenous Virtual Speaker Series. I hope everyone's doing the best that they can in these bizarre times. I know many of us have either finals to prepare for, or if you're like myself, preparing for a child. So it's very interesting times, but there's always a light in the gloomy times as well. So I think one of those beams of light is who we have today on our speaking series, Sandy Grande. And so I'll turn it over to my partner and colleague, Virgil Moorhead, to kind of segue into these conversations.
Thank you, Charlie. Welcome. I'm Virgil Moorhead. For those of you that are tuning in for the first time on our speaker series, I'm part of the Big Lagoon Rancheria. I'm Yurok in Talawa, and I'm also the Behavioral Health Director here at Two Feathers, Native American Family Services. Two Feathers is in Humboldt County in the town of McKinleyville, which is about 5.5 hours north of San Francisco, right on the beautiful Pacific Ocean. It's a little foggy, like it is often here today, but you know, it's we were able to get a little bit of rain yesterday and today, which is good. And overall, it's a good day. So I'm honored to welcome our guest today. Like Charlie was saying, I've been following her work and for years, ever since graduate school, and you know, one of her seminal books are, you know, Red Pedagogy, that was really sort of put, I think, Indigenous studies and from a very critical perspective on the map. And so Sandy, a little bit about her is she's a professor of education in the Center for Community Study of Race and Ethnicity at Connecticut University.
Connecticut, yeah.
Or Connecticut College, sorry about that. And she is, if I get it right,
Quechua.
Quechua. I was practicing. I went over your talk to see how it was said right, but
That's all right.
I didn't get it right. Dang.
All right.
So welcome, Sandy.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks so much, Virgil and Charlie, for the opportunity to be in conversation with you two. Calling in over here from Connecticut, the territories of the Mohegan, Mashantucket, Pequot. There's quite a few folks here: Eastern Pequot, Schaghticoke, Golden Hill, Pawcusset, and Nipmuc, Lenape. And just sheltering in place here with my dad. He's 92, going strong. So, you know, we're just trying to survive these times in many ways.
Yes. Yes. So, you know, thank you again for having you or being on here. And, you know, that kind of, you know, talking about your father and you know, we've did a, you know, catching up on some of your work and who you are. And, you know, I think one of the things that struck me and really how maybe our work at Two Feathers is aligned with much of what the work that you've been doing is around relationality and relationships. And so my first question to you, Sandy, is like, what does it mean to be, do you think, grounded in relationality in these very challenging, difficult times right now?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think in the very immediate sense, it's interesting to me that as people around the globe are sheltering in place, those that have, you know, the privilege of being housed peoples, and I really feel for our houseless relatives in that sense, and the ways in which they've been denied and disavowed by the states. But you know, for most of us, we're spending much more time with our family and kin and relatives, and it's been interesting to see how that's been very transformative. I think in really positive ways. So I think being in good relation is really actually, in the purest sense, just that, being in contact, being in touch, caring for each other, learning how to care for each other. Mm-hmm. It's not easy. It's very challenging. It's work every day to kind of be able to communicate about what our needs are, how we can be cared for, how we're best cared for. It's just an ongoing, journey with the people in your life. In a more global sense, I think we're also seeing that the damage that capital has done in particular. I think, one of the central projects of capital is really to disconnect in so many ways. And we see to disconnect people from our food sources, to disconnect people from their own labor, to disconnect people from their surroundings, so that you don't think twice about the violence that you do to the land or to the waters, right? Because you follow a different motivation of profit. And so and it's everything in between. And I think in so many ways we're seeing, if we're paying attention, we're seeing the importance of relationality all around us.
Thank you. And sort of a follow-up, because one of the objectives to our speaker series is to sort of unpack some of the processes, the ways of going about life and being in life, so that our community and those that are watching in can take some things and maybe it'll give them some hope, or maybe that'll give them a different perspective on critiquing or helping to change the oppressive institutions in our society. And so one of the things I saw that was really moving, and I'll briefly read it and maybe we can unpack it a little bit, but in one of you were on a panel and I was watching it, and one of the things that, what I really appreciate about your work is how much you call into question, things that seem normal, right? And so one of the things that you said is, what is fast, what is young, what is individualist, what is new, what is secular, what is winning, what is extraction, and it goes on, but calling into question all of those things that we kind of take for granted. And so I guess that quote in my follow-up is how do we go about in our daily lives, whether it's a college student such as Charlie or myself as a behavioral health director, or you in the being multiple worlds, whether it's in the community or in academia, how do we go about, do you think, calling into question and working to change some of these ideologies, or these not only ideologies but the material sort of impacts they have?
Yeah. I mean, again, it's just constant work and vigilance. All of us on some level, that requires, all of us to see the waters that we're swimming in. And there's probably nothing more challenging than that, because as you said, you get used to it. You're just swimming in the water, you don't see it. You're taught not to see it beyond just not seeing it. And sometimes you're punished for actually calling it out or seeing it. So there's not a whole lot of incentive to get to know the water you're swimming in, so to speak. But then in many ways, like in my classrooms, once students start to kind of peel back some of those layers, they often talk about how they can't not unsee it. Once you get a sense of it, once you get the sense of the shape of it, it's hard to kind of go back to this place of not noticing. And then that's a good thing, because you're on your journey that way. And then I really like how you say it's not just these ideas, right? Ideology definitely has a material capacity. And so it's also a practice. Everything about relationality, whether that's faith or that's love, it's also a practice, right? My mom used to say, pray with your feet. So it's not just this kind of blind faith, oh, I hope this, I hope that. You hope something for sure, but then you also do whatever work needs to happen to help your hopes come to be, right? So I think it's also a practice, and to kind of build the kind of support system around you to help you, engage in that practice, because it often takes a lot of courage. Because for the most part, we're fighting against, decolonization is a thing because colonization is ongoing. So a lot of our practices require resistance and refusal and, struggling against. A lot of our practices are generative also, about practicing our own ways and our own knowledges. But you can't do it alone, right? So you have to, that's why relationality again is important. You build a network around you so that you can continue to have the support and the sustenance and the courage you need to keep going out there. And I would say, in terms of my own personal work, I try to always, as a teacher, first of young people and then of college students. And then it's one of those things that I think you're always thinking about. I'm always thinking about the pedagogical, which is meaning how are we teaching and learning in this particular space? And so I think about everyday life that way in terms of what is the pedagogy in this instance of me being home and of elder care. What am I learning from my dad? Are there times when I'm teaching my dad? Are we learning together? What does being in relationship to him mean for my life? And I don't know if it was in that panel or somewhere else. I've certainly written about a little bit. I'm not the most patient person.
In the panel on CUNY University with Michelle Fine.
Oh, yeah. Okay. I'm not the most patient person. And my dad, he's a very active 92-year-old. Don't mistake that. But, he has a very different pace about his life. And in this context, his pace is my pace. And I've got to learn something from that.
Makes sense. And so I guess one more follow-up is what is it that you think, because I think one of the things in my own life that I try to increasingly do is share from my own personal experience and that what I've lived in and really being honest with myself, but honest with try to stay out of the theory as much and speak from my own personal experience, which, includes my own struggles with substance use and some of the intergenerational things that many of our communities experience. And so my question for you is what is kind of who and what has shaped you to become the person that you've become and really specifically I'm curious about just because I was wrestling with all these different theories, anti-capitalist, critical theory, Paulo Freire, and I'm all over. And then I read your book. I was like, man, that gets it all together. That's awesome. What shaped you?
Oh, gosh. Well, I mean, for sure, my family, right? My family and their own connection to their communities and their families, very extensive. Both my mom and dad had very large families. In learning about what their knowledge bases are, the traditional and community knowledge base is. And so much of that really is about interconnection, I think, and relationality, again, about ancestral knowledge. It's intergenerational, it's it's all these things all together. And I think growing up as a kid, especially mostly as it played out in school, because my understanding or my worldview seemed quite different from what I was being taught in school. Not just what's in the books. I think we talk a lot about the invisibility of Native peoples, and that's important. Of course, representation is important, but it's all the other stuff, the individualism, the kind of competition that is, you move up because you're pushing other people down. I do think Indigenous peoples, enjoy competition, but in a different way. The kind of the value of profit over all these things were things that I think I really struggled with, but didn't understand why really. And then it was actually probably not till graduate school. And I read this book called The Social Construction of Knowledge. It was required by Berger and Luckman in must have been a sociology of ed course. And the idea of the social construction of knowledge is that, kind of this notion contesting around very basically and simply questioning the idea of universal truth, and that our social realities are actually constructed by ourselves. And I can't even begin to tell you how that idea just blew me away, because I thought, well, if people created this socially constructed this reality, then we can undo it. Then we can move in it toward a different reality, right? And so in that sense, I think ideas and theory, and I know there's a lot of maybe resistance or often fear or misunderstanding about theory, but I think what theory did for me was to give me a language for something I had already experienced. And it continues to serve that. So I enjoy the kinds of theory that center praxis, as you said. You mentioned Paulo Freire. So this notion of we move from ideas to our practices, back to informing our ideas in a new way because of our practice, and then those ideas then change because we have different experiences, right? So it's also a way of saying I believe in the dialectic, that life is full of contradictions. Everything we know in the world has contradictions. And so it's a process of, I think the synthesis in the dialectic is often understood as like the middle ground, and it's a really poor understanding of it. But it's like, how do we move between these contradictions to come to new understandings, again, in a really simple way? So, I don't know if I'm unusual or not, but I enjoy theory. I'm a bit of a theory wonk. I don't know that I always understand it, but I really enjoy it. To me, it's like another language. And I'm bad at most other languages, whether it's math or learning, I don't know, different languages. But for some reason, I enjoy learning different theories to then like see what applies and doesn't apply to life. But I find it to be expansive. It expands my understanding of the world, and anything that does that, I enjoy.
Thank you.
Sure.
So I know I've been asking a few questions and turn over to my colleague, Charlie.
Charlie, what's going on?
Well, not much. Thanks, Virgil. Those are some great questions, and thanks for engaging with those too, Sandy. One thing that I really liked what you said was pray with your feet, because I feel like oftentimes that, the hopeful, the optimism is something that got our people through tough times when they haven't really been able to kind of exercise that on the ground work as much as they might wanted to. And so that's something that that's why I go to school. That's why I do these things, like take up space and just that's a part of my healing process, is to find my voice and find my purpose. And then that'll like kind of open up opportunities for happiness and success. So that's something that I've always thought, because, family members who really optimistic, really have great ideas and ambition. But I'm like, well, look, how do we do that? How do we mobilize that? How do we get that like in progress, or have like application, or how do we implement those ideas, And so that's something that really got me through. And so, like I said, academia has kind of been my platform or my medium of kind of doing that on the ground work. And a lot of times I've heard comments like, why are you so like pessimistic, or why are you so political all the time? And, it kind of correlates with what you had written in one of your articles that I was just reading about how being Indigenous is like kind of inherently political. And so it's kind of interesting. And so I just was wondering if you wanted to unpack that for folks who may have not seen that article or have read some of those.
Yeah. I mean, I think as human subjects in the world, right, all of us life is inherently political, however people understand that, and not on the spectrum as of right, left, a party kind of politics, but a politics in that we're all living versions of life that are often in competition with each other, right? So it's not just, I think I wrote at some point, it's not just that we have differences, that we often are living competing moral visions of the world. And so in that sense, all of our lives are political. But it also does mean, and I think doing political work looks all kinds of different ways for that reason, right? Sometimes it is just living being. I mean, when we're in a time when somebody can get killed, a Black man can get killed for jogging. When Native peoples at Standing Rock, the Lakota trying to defend their own land, and they're not armed, get water cannons and military, police, and whatever, and then white folks can show up at the Capitol building or whatever with AK-47s and nothing happens, no arrests. We all live political lives. So, and I do think, some people, the academy by definition is a political institution. Teaching is a political act. Want to give a shout out to some of my comrades at U of A right now from the Indigenous Teacher Ed Project that, right as we speak are like meeting with university leadership, trying to encourage them to acknowledge in a responsible way the relationship and responsibility to the Native nations of Arizona and globally, really. So the work is never ending. It looks so many different ways. There's so many different people in my life whose work I admire, but for Native peoples, it is often about just trying to, like other peoples, but the peoples that we are in solidarity with, it often is just trying to be, just trying to, if you think about in South Dakota right now, right? The governor of South Dakota wanted them to take down their checkpoints, complete misunderstanding of Indigenous sovereignty, but they're just trying to protect their people right now in this time of COVID, so it's really something to be in a time when just trying to live, you're already engaging in a political act, especially if the person trying to live that life is Black or Brown or Native.
Yeah, that's interesting. That's something that's kind of happening here locally too. I know that the tribe that I'm a part of, the Hoopa Valley tribe, is trying to exercise that sovereignty to protect our people from either passing through folks or just like out of the area who come up there to try and get groceries because other facilities might be over impacted and stuff. So it's interesting on how that's a threat, but when folks are trying to like reopen, like open up businesses, small businesses matter, like, and it's almost like a protest to other protests. So it's like really interesting. And it goes back to just kind of how, like now I think there's like, we're going into phase 2 here in Humboldt County of like reopening businesses. And it's just like, but there's a spike, like there was a couple, like a week almost of like 0 cases, which was great, is relieving. And now that that's kind of been the headlines of different news articles, I feel like that gives people this idea like, okay, it's good to go back to, somewhat back to normal. And now there's this spike. And so it kind of just sheds light on how they value economics over like people, social well-being. And so it's just like really interesting. And it's unfortunate because, bringing the life into this world, it's like, no, like we're trying to like shelter in place. So then there's at least, there's a chance, and so I think that's a really interesting dynamic that we are all navigating right now.
Yeah.
And so it's just really unfortunate,
Yeah. I mean, if there was ever a time that it's laid bare that capital and the state value profit over people and anything else living, it's now, I mean, certainly that message has been driven home for some of us since time immemorial, but I think it's more apparent to more people. I hope right now in this moment.
I had a follow-up question about, one of the things that's coming up for me during these times, and, I was just like, I think it was yesterday to my partner, was like, I know that a lot of these media outlets they're just lying to us. They're just lying. And that's just my gut feeling. And I mean, if you look at the history of our country, it's been one lie after another. And so my question is like, how do we who are, trying to stand up for and fight for, our own people, our land, our sort of sovereignty, like how do we discern like truth from not truth from I think like one of the people that I follow and I think is doing a really good job, and Nick Estes is putting out stuff and really I think telling a story that we need to hear. And so like my question is like how do we, for those that are that are viewing this dialogue today, like go about, finding that the not saying that there's one truth, but just like the some reality, some truth to
Mhm.
what's going on. Like what would you say about that?
Yeah, I mean, it's really, I was just thinking before this I don't know what we're calling it, Facebook Live event, uh,
Speaker series.
speaker series, and thinking about how like this notion of decolonizing education or decolonial education is often perceived as this very radical, revolutionary, sometimes leftist, I think erroneously, but project. But when we think about what does that actually look like? What could it look like? I mean, it could look many different ways, but I think in this moment, something that's taken me aback sometimes is that the practice of it right now seems so conservative. Like, as one example, the misunderstandings about and of the US Constitution that circulate right now, about the rule of law that it circulates right now, is astounding from our own, supposedly the person who occupies the White House right now. So who knew that kind of the revolution would really look something as what was once as conservative as like just teaching with accuracy what the founding documents were like, right? I think it's Article 6 of the Constitution that requires the U.S. settler state to honor its treaties with other nations, right? On a daily basis, treaties are being violated, and so when Native peoples are standing up for their land or for their water or to protect their nations or whatever, on some level, even though, I think we clearly need to have understanding of Indigenous sovereignty and what that means for each people, because it will mean something different because each people has a different history. But often it's just like honor the stuff that you already said, that is the rule of law, really, so it's frightening and then also fascinating how sometimes these projects can look the same, whether it's decolonial or a kind of a very conservative project. So it's a long way of saying, like, I think just understanding history, if everybody just try to understand through doing their own archival work. Shout out to all the public libraries. They're closed right now, but many are trying to find ways to serve their communities. Which people have written the history of your towns, of your communities, of your land. Read as many different ones as possible. Look in every town has a historical, usually has some sort of historical center or a place where they have the archives. And we used to depend on our elders, like, for that information. And those of us that still have that privilege, it's something we should take seriously and be in conversation with them as much as we can. And that's one of the things that really hurts and is frightening about this time too right now, is how much of the deaths to COVID are elders and seniors. And I forget the statistics, but at one point I think it's between 60 and 80%, depending on what community you're talking about. And that's such a unfathomable loss, really, for all kinds of knowledge. So we need to do our best now to capture that, I think.
Thank you. And so as a follow-up, maybe a slight pivot, I know, one of the things when I was before I moved back home, so, this area is where I grew up. I was at Stanford, and I was just, searching, because it wasn't adding up, the field of mental health and other things. And I got into and joined the International Socialist Organization and went to some of their conferences. And, that's where I came across Nick's work and others. And I know one of the things that you say, or you quote Glenn Goodall, and when he says, for indigenous people to live, capitalism must die. And so, how does that also play into, our understanding in today's times of this sort of, because it's not just anti-capitalism. I think it's like, what you've done in so much of your work, merged different fields and had a strong indigenous perspective, a strong anti-capitalist, and sort of critiqued both, but put forth some ideas. And so I just, curious if you can unpack for our audience a little bit about, for indigenous people to live, capitalism must die.
Yeah, and would definitely want to encourage reading Glenn Couthard's Redskins White Mass book, and certainly get to know the folks of the Red Nation that are doing fantastic work. And I do think, I mean, again, especially in this particular moment, hoping and praying with my feet that capitalism is dying. I think it is dying, and we also need to help it die. And it's not just sort of the economic system. I think most people understand like capitalism in a really simplistic way as opposed to communism, or as opposed to whatever they're imagining. And it's like, well, it's the best system that we have. And so like, I often encourage folks to think sort of beyond. I mean, it's certainly, that's the core, is this particular kind of exchange where you don't own the profit from your own labor. But beyond that, what does a capitalist system do? And I think I've already talked about, at the heart of it is really an allegiance to a real severe form of individualism, pretty severe form of competition, and certainly disconnection. So all of those things, what do all of those aspects of capitalism as an ideology, what's the impact of those things on our lives? And we see, what does it mean as an example for corporations? I think I just read Bezos, who's the head of Amazon, has, as a result of COVID-19, he's now a trillionaire. That's obscene and absurd. Just thinking about that, what does it mean for one person in one company to profit in the trillions of, 80,000 people dying in this nation and thousands of more dying globally? Like, what does that really mean? How do we really sit with that? His own workers, don't have health care, aren't being safe, or don't have adequate health care and aren't safe. What are their working conditions? What does it mean when that's acceptable or normalized? And, I certainly personally hope for a really different kind of life outside of that kind of a logic. And I wouldn't even use the word ethic, I don't think. And at the end of the day, I don't even think, it serves the people who think it serves them, because, I don't think eventually you can't build the walls high enough and fast enough and put people around your house with AK-40. I mean, if that's how you want to live, to make sure that you have clean water and you have access to a food source as you deny it to everybody else, I don't know. At the end of the day, I think a much more planetary, global kind of understanding, as opposed to individualist understanding. Even though I'm here in Hartford, Connecticut, I depend and want to know what's happening in the Amazonian forests in Brazil and Peru and those peoples. What's happening there impacts the air that I breathe. And so for that reason, I should be invested, I think, in what's happening in their lives and what corporations are impacting their ways of being for profit, again, for profit.
Yeah, and so like in the field of mental health, and there's this concept, or psychologizing everything, which often is turning the sort of structural systemic issues into individual issues. And that we just, and then how do you intervene? You do it in individual therapy. And so, the problems at the individual level are intrapsychically. And so, we try to, at Two Feathers, kind of take into consideration the systemic structural issues and how to intervene at that level just as much as at the individual level. And so, to add a little bit to what you had just said, I'm wondering if you could unpack a little bit more specifically in education, because we titled this conversation, our virtual Indigenous speaker series with you today, Decolonizing Education, reflections on that. And I think a lot of the people viewing this conversation today are people working within schools, whether it's our universities. And so, where does the sort of, if capitalism must die, capitalism must die for Indigenous people to continue. And many of our Indigenous people are in universities or in schools that aren't ours. So if I just wanted to see if you could add a little bit more around the decolonizing education piece, with maybe yeah.
Boy, you both of you asking some good hard questions. I mean, again, I think it's more the ethos of a school, and how we imagine teaching and learning. Before we ever open a book, what are young people learning in school systems that have their own history through settler colonialism, right? And through that came into being to erase indigeneity, really. I mean, that was an express goal, right? To missionize, built on stolen land often, etc. So we have to understand that that's the genealogy of schooling, and then how does that live on today, and how do we make sense of that? But I often ask my students, like, if in fact, if some of the values undergirding capitalism, as an example, we take individualism. Like, how do we learn that? How do we learn to value? How are we taught to learn to value individualism? And how is that legitimated or supported or reinforced by school? And sometimes, they come up with really great ideas, even in, kindergarten or first grade. How do we learn that the individual is important? What kinds of things do we celebrate about the individualism? And they usually come up with great things like, everything from birthdays. We celebrate the day of one's birth in a very particular way, if that person gets all the attention and all the gifts and all that, as opposed to like in other cultures where, some people don't celebrate birthdays in the same way, the date of one's individual birth, but you might have other ceremonial practices along the way, but that often involve the person giving and acknowledging how you came to this milestone, right? There's all kinds of sayings that you learn in school that really reinforce stories, that kids are told about individualism and individual responsibility. Where the individual gets celebrated. Even the English language is very much centered in eyes and being able to distinguish the singular thing from the plural thing. So it's structured in so many different ways. And if you really sit with that, you can come up with all kinds of examples of how we learn individualism and then how it's reinforced. So that by the time they come to like university, where I see students now, to work with each other in solidarity with each other, to learn together, just feels either they just really don't like it anymore, or it feels wrong sometimes, or it feels like cheating. Sometimes people say, like, I feel like I'm cheating because what do you mean I can talk to this person and see we write together? That's crazy talk. So, it's funny. And these are, whether they're Native kids or non-Native kids, it doesn't matter. It's so you know, the notion of something functioning hegemonically, the word of hegemony or hegemonically, it's when it becomes so much a part of the air we breathe, you don't see it. It's just, and it's only when you come up against something that's different that you realize that that's something that you've learned to value. And so, so I think the notion of like decolonizing education, again, whatever that, and it again means so many different things. I mean, on the one hand, I think it is about land, you know, so it's like, where's the land you sit on? Whose land? How did the community or the school come to be on that land? It's about the return of land, not just acknowledging it. But I think it's also beyond that. You know, I think it's what kind of knowledge do we need to have to learn to live in good relation with the land and the waters and the other people and beings on that land. If that was our curriculum, it would look entirely different than it does right now, right? If that's the one learning objective, I guess, our schools would look very different, you know? For one, we wouldn't spend it all inside all the time. Right?
Yeah, I really appreciate when you're talking about how individualism is kind of embedded in us at like beginning, like so early in our development that it just becomes such a normal thing. And then obviously the outside influences make it like a socially accepted thing. So for example, if one family was like, well, every day is a day we're celebrating your life and your birth, and then like they go to like the day that they were birthed, it's like they don't have a celebration, then it's like, what, like everyone else is having birthday celebration, everyone else is having cake and having like a special day, and it's just like, I want that, how come I can't have that? And so it's almost like a social status to have a fun and a lot of people at your birthday. And so it's like it really starts to like teach you these different expectations, and so it's really difficult to get out of that unless like the community like is on the same page and your friends are like really understanding of that and celebrate you every day like everyone deserves. And it's very much like capitalistic minded, like especially with like different days like Mother's Day. I love celebrating that day for my mom and my grandmothers, my aunts, different people who I really admire and respect for many reasons. But it's just like it kind of gets me kind of complacent in those other 364 other days where it's just like, almost like don't call them every day like I probably should. I don't tell them I love them every day that I probably should. It's just like, but I'll be there for Mother's Day. I'll tell them I love them on Mother's Day. So it really marginalizes relationalities with people that we love. And so like, what does it mean to like decolonize relationships? It means like just getting outside and engaging with other relationalities, not just humans, like our more than human relatives, and the river, the mountains, the air, like getting that fresh air, like especially in times of COVID, it's like there's times where I don't get a breath of fresh air until the afternoon after I get out of all my meetings. So it's like it really takes a toll on the mental health, and so it's really interesting on how everything that we know as life is interconnected with this like this greater like mobile engine of the United States of America. So it's interesting. Like whenever I have these conversations, it's like you just start questioning everything about life. It's like, what is life? It's pretty funny. But
Yeah.
I really appreciate hearing that from folks like yourself. It's just like, okay, I'm not a crazy person. This is not me.
Yeah, you gotta sit with why is this hard? And I'd be curious, Virgil, to hear like the kinds of things you're hearing on the mental health front, because it's like, it's fascinating that people, not some people, again, some folks are, the essential worker force is still working and they're predominantly Black, Brown, and Native, right? So, but it's interesting, I think a lot of people are having to face how much of their identity was work and labor. So that if they're home and supposedly, assuming you're not sheltering in place by yourself, but supposedly home with loved ones who you should feel connected to. And I know there's lots of things people are trying to still school from home and work from home. And so there's lots of different pressures in the home. So I've heard like reports of lots of pressure, but then also some good things that come out of people being reconnected to the people in their lives. Or if you're home alone, but still have access to the outdoors, if you have that opportunity. Maybe some people are, there's supposedly a boom in like gardening and people growing their own food. And it's just interesting how we're resurrecting different aspects of life that I think in many ways we've been disconnected from this very fast, there's different kinds of and different phases of capital as well. So we're in this particular moment of neoliberal global capital that I think is different than earlier forms of capital. But in this particular moment where everything, people have like branded their own bodies and minds themselves. They don't even wait for other people to do it to them. I don't know so I'm curious what's happening on the mental health front.
Yeah, I think at least for us up here, we, a family service agency, so we really focus on youth, and often the youth that are often most disconnected within the different systems, whether it's school or in the foster care system, or just really facing a lot of individual, structural systemic issues. And I think it's been a challenge to connect. Because one of the things that we try to do at Two Feathers is meet the community and our families where they're at. And so I think one of the reasons why we've been fairly successful is that we're in the schools, or we go to the homes. And so if you can't do that, it's pretty hard to connect, right? And so I think that the ones that are struggling with getting connection are the ones that were already struggling. Because of, their disconnection, whether it's at their own home. Like if some of the kids that, come to school, they come to school just and they ditch class, but they're leaving their home life. And so now they're in their home life nonstop. And so I think that it's, increasingly there's a lot of pressure and there's a lot of like tension building up. And so, I think I don't really entirely have the answer. I just feel like that we have, as an agency at Two Feathers and around mental health, have had a really hard time connecting. And because, if you're doing text messages or if you're doing tele-behavioral health, you got to have Wi-Fi. You got to have the money to pay, your phone bill. And if, there's the jobs and unemployment are going up. So I think we have to, look at the individual behavior, not that it's a lack of motivation, but it's, all these systemic issues. So it's been to answer your question, a real challenge. And we're trying to be creative in meeting the needs of our community. But in regards to connection, which I think is at the heart of mental health, is really about relationships. And that's what we're, just trying to build long, sustaining, healthy relationships with a lot of our youth. And that's what the research says that are successful in therapy too, is, the relationship. And so I think the relationship and maintaining it has been a challenge.
Yeah. I mean, if nothing else, I hope, again, there's maybe a broader understanding or a deeper understanding of how important not just being around and in the mix with other people, but really being connected to other people. Like, what does that really mean? Not just like, because a lot of people are saying Zoom doesn't do it, you see people on Zoom, but it's still not sufficient. So I hope many more people are thinking about what does it take, or, what are really the components of forging really good, healthy, strong connections and relations to people and whatever is around us.
I see that I message you all to Charlie. We'll see if there's any questions from the Facebook audience. But one of the questions I have before we end, I just wanted to ask, because it's fairly relevant to our current times, our what's going on in our area, is around gender in the ways that, you've, I think, took a critical eye on how we see patriarchy, how we see gender relations within Indigenous communities. And so I'm just curious if you could unpack a little bit about sort of the way you've been thinking about, gender relationships, or just relationships across all the different gender sexual identities, and how I think, it's really relevant to how we think about much of our work in mental health or in education, and in indigenous communities.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly a part of many of Indigenous people's traditional ways of life and understanding to understand the fluidity of gender expression. Um, and and so I certainly think that that's what we should be affirming in schools and mental health capacities all around. Everybody deserves the opportunity to be who they are and express their gender in all parts of their identity in a way that feels good for them, helps them be in good relationship to other people. So as much as we can support that, I think we should. In terms of maybe coming full circle a little bit, when you said, red pedagogy brought some things together. The other piece of that story was actually initially the dissertation I wasn't allowed to write. So I remember when I just sketched it out a little bit, and my committee members were like, well, is this about Native education and the history of schooling, or is it about land? And then you've got some chapter in there about women and gender, and then it's on, it's like, which is it? Well, it's all of that, because if you're talking about Indigenous schooling and the ways in which that became a threat to the settler state, then you have to talk about land. If you talk about land, you have to talk about gender, because much of our land relations are gendered and kind of relationality in general. So then if you do that, then you have to also talk about governance and sovereignty and patriarchy, because the way the Dawes Act randomly put heads of house, it just, to me, there was no way to disentangle it. And they couldn't understand it. They're like, no, you have to focus. Dissertation, graduate work is about focusing. It's drilling down. So thankfully, I knew enough at that time not to really fight that fight. I just wrote about something I, wasn't as personal, I guess. And I set it all aside and knew I would come back to it. And so, which is what I did. And so, I mean, I think on that way, there's lots of talk, about intersectionality these days, which is a very important concept. But the notion of intersectionality can only become important if prior to that, things had been disconnected and disentangled and disarticulated from each other, right? So you have to put it back together. And I think, again, in many Indigenous languages, there's already an expression of an interconnection and an intersection, so that if you are talking about land, there's an understanding, or water, and then you have an understanding in your communities of women as water carriers or kind of bearers of life. And then, we certainly want to support kind of the work around intersectionality, but there's a way in which I also think most of our ideologies, worldviews, ways of knowing already center connection. So it becomes redundant. So again, a long way maybe of saying of issues of gender and sexuality are always circulating there, with issues of race and nation and faith and how we practice so many things. And it's really sad to see, within our communities, issues like the murdered and missing Indigenous women, where women are targeted for very particular reasons, trans relatives targeted for very particular reasons. And that's just another front that I think we have to join the fight and struggle on, to protect those members of our community.
Thank you.
Yeah, before I get to the questions and comments in the comment section, I really appreciated what you had just shared with us. It's very well said. And you see me shaking my head when you're talking about how, so what is this? Is this, political? Is this environmental? Is this land back? Like, where are you going with this? And, being in a master's program, they're like, we need you to be specific. And I'm like, how am I supposed to be specific when everything's intertangled? They're like, yeah, everything is intertangled. We understand that everything's interconnected. But for this, we really need you to specify, and so like, okay, whatever. And then now I'm just at the point where I'm like, no, this is what I'm doing. Like, understanding that I do have agency over what I put into like academia. It's like, no, I'm not going to put my name on something that you guys want me to do. Like, I want to do something that I'm passionate about. That's what got me here. And so I really like that. And so it's just like, now I'm at the point where I'm like, I'm going to talk about the history. I'm going to talk about anthropological influences. I'm going to talk about, reimagining what management looks like. And like, man, you're really ambitious. I'm like, if that's what you want to call it,
Yeah.
But yeah, and so that kind of touches on a comment that I really liked, and it's talking about how this time of COVID really shows how interconnected we are and how harmful it is to be kind of like individualized. So I thought that was a comment that was worth vocalizing. But a question from Kathy Eddings is, Katie, sorry. I struggle to explain red pedagogy to non-native counterparts in education. Can you help unpack that for us and them?
Sure. There's this emerged, and I shout out to all the folks in Robeson County who were putting together the old mainstream academy, and they worked to center red pedagogy, and then it blew up into this big thing. But anyway, so I hope they're coming back around. But in terms of the book, it's the red is a metaphor for red people, right? For Indigenous people. And it's also a bit of a play on kind of acknowledging that in education, again, at that time when I was writing, like the frontier of a real kind of new vision for education was critical theory, of which Marxist theory is a component of. And I do think there's much to learn from. I think it's becoming apparent in this moment of how Marxist theory, how socialist projects, again, when it's just a radical idea that you want to feed and house everyone, there's obviously a lot to value and to learn there. But the project was really about how we can learn from these critical theories, but also what's the ways in which even in the most critical, radical, revolutionary forms of understanding about what education is, on some level, in my opinion, was really still misunderstanding who Indigenous peoples are. And so that's, in I think as simplest terms, it's an engagement and a critique of critical theory. And then in a much more generous sense, I also hope it kind of gestures towards then what an Indigenous education, or at least in educational worldview, can look like. What's a solidarity project look like? And in terms of a praxis, in terms of like a red praxis of red pedagogy, I think, Virgil, you mentioned the folks of Red Nation, and I think more than anybody else, they're really teaching young people, anybody, intergenerationally, they're teaching, what good theory is. And then they're also engaging in mutual aid. They're literally feeding people, right? Working on the front lines of defending LGBTQ2 spirit, trans people. They're doing the political work in multiple ways. And I think, that's what it can look like on the ground when you embrace and acknowledge that both having an understanding of the language and the theory of a project, and then actually doing the work on the ground and understanding that interrelationship as well. It's another relationship that I think is really important. And lots of people, I'm just, because you mentioned Red Nation at the beginning, and I love Nick and Melanie and all the folks who do the work there, but that's just one example. But it's happening so many different places. Black Lives Matter in schools movement in particular. there's the folks doing the Defenders of the Water School. So many different places, thankfully, more and more, I think.
Thank you for answering that for our audience. And
Sure.
looking at the clock, it's about that time. So I thank everyone in the audience for engaging with us. We had a really good time here today. Thank you, Sandy, once again for joining us and sharing some of your wisdom and perspective. We all could use it, get through these hard times. So we appreciate that. And tomorrow we'll have a special guest to me is my father, Ron Reed, and Beth Rose Middleton. So I'm excited to finish the week off strong. And I think that's all I have to say for now. Virgil, do you have any last thoughts?
No, just thank you, Sandy. I think that, through this speaker series, I've come to really see the importance even more of relationality. And I think just in our brief conversations the brief conversations I've had with you, you've really modeled that to me, and just the importance of paying it forward and giving back and really, being of service. And I really appreciate that. And thank you for that. And, and I'll do my best. And I know Charlie will too, to continue to pay it forward and to give back. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Charlie and Virgil. It was a pleasure, and best of luck with the new additions to your own families. That's beautiful news.
Thank you. Thank you.
Or pictures or post pictures once it happens.
Okay.
Charlie doesn't know, I think, and I'm having a girl, but Charlie's waiting, right?
Yep.
Oh, wow.
Taking it old school.
Nice.
Okay, take care.
All right, y'all. Out.
Bye.
Doing it.